Lorenzo Valez buried his wife in 2016 after she vanished from their yacht. Closed casket, empty coffin, case closed. 9 years later, he's walking through a Miami mall when he sees her across the luxury corridor, alive, laughing with two young boys and a man who just kissed her head like she's his wife. The moment their eyes meet, her shopping bag hits the floor, and Lorenzo realizes the most dangerous truth of his life. She didn't drown. She escaped with his money, faked her death, and built a perfect new family while he mourned a ghost. He spent 9 years carrying the kind of rage that has no outlet, the kind of suspicion that has no proof. And then on a Saturday afternoon in a luxury mall outside Miami, he sees a woman who looks exactly like his dead wife. She's with two young boys and a girl. He's thinking if Isabella were alive, she'd be older now, maybe softer. Before he can convince himself he's seeing ghosts, he watches a man approach her and kiss her temple. That must be her husband. But the moment Lorenzo gets a clear view of the man's face, clean, ordinary, safe, his entire world detonates. Welcome to Empire Stories. This is the story of a man who controlled everything except the one person who mattered. Subscribe for weekly deep dives into the dark side of power. Lorenzo Valez was born in 1978 in the Bronx, a neighborhood where respect was earned in blood and kept through fear, where Sunday Mass was attended by men with guns under their suits, where family meant everything and betrayal meant death. He became the boss at 32 when his father, Domenico, died of a heart attack during a federal raid. Massive coronary, the paramedics said. Gone before the sirens stopped. So Lorenzo did what bosses do. He survived, expanded territory, bought judges, politicians, anyone with a price tag. Whatever kept the empire growing, whatever kept the Valez name above the law, whatever proved he was more than his father ever was. Years passed like that. Violence, money, power, repeat. Then in his mid-30s, Lorenzo met Isabella Reed at a charity gala his lawyer made him attend for appearances. She was elegant, educated, came from old money that had gone quiet. She didn't flinch when she learned his name. She already knew exactly who he was. They married in 2015. Lorenzo thought he'd finally done it. Legitimized himself through her pedigree, gained access to her family's clean business connections, built the image of a man who'd evolved beyond his father's brutal legacy. Isabella Reed seemed like the crown jewel Lorenzo didn't even know he was collecting. Isabella Reed was born in 1984 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Only child, the one who carried all her parents' faded dreams. Her family wasn't cruel, just hollow. Old money stretched too thin, the kind of people who kept up appearances while quietly selling off heirlooms. So Isabella learned early how to perform, how to read dangerous men, how to smile through anything. She built a life in art curation on that skill, made tasteful choices, maintained elegant silence, appeared at all the right galas. Her former colleagues would later say the same thing. Isabella always knew which battles to avoid. But there were shadows. A previous engagement that ended abruptly. The man never wanted to explain why she'd left. And financial desperation. Family debts that piled up quietly behind the Connecticut estate's crumbling facade. The kind of thing you hide behind pearls and a trust fund surname. But Lorenzo didn't care about any of that. He wanted the legitimacy she offered. He needed the respectability. Lorenzo Valez, born to violence, built on blood. A man who controlled 12 city blocks, 3 judges, and enough dirty money to buy silence from anyone. For years, it was Lorenzo and his empire, one man against the world. He had his own code, his own system, his own brutal efficiency. He was untouchable, or so he believed, until he brought Isabella into it. Around late 2015, something shifted. His associates would later recall it. Lorenzo became possessive after the wedding, stopped trusting her out of his sight, started monitoring her movements. His driver noticed it too. Isabella stopped smiling in the car after their 6-month anniversary. When asked about it once, she just said marriage takes adjustment and changed the subject. If you looked at the security footage from their building during that time, you can see it. Isabella entering alone, face carefully neutral. Lorenzo arriving hours later, sometimes with lipstick on his collar. The doorman never said a word, but everyone knew. By early 2016, the distance between Lorenzo and Isabella had grown into something Lorenzo couldn't control anymore. She barely spoke at dinner, spent hours in her art studio with the door locked, stopped attending his business functions, stopped pretending. Lorenzo noticed it. Or at least, he noticed she was slipping from his grasp. July 2016, Lorenzo made a decision. A yacht cruise, Caribbean, 10 days, just the two of them. No business, no interruptions, a chance to remind her who she belonged to. His attorney would later say Lorenzo was trying so hard to keep what he thought he owned. He had no idea she was planning her resurrection. Lorenzo Valez didn't raise his voice when he was angry. That's what made him terrifying. The night Isabella found the lipstick-stained collar, he simply placed his whiskey glass on the marble counter, the ice cubes settling with a delicate clink, and asked her if she had a problem with how he conducted his business. Business. That's what he called the blonde from the Lower East Side Club, the brunette from his attorney's office, the rotating catalog of women who understood that Lorenzo Valez took what he wanted. Isabella stood in their penthouse kitchen, still in the Dior gown from the charity auction, and said nothing. She'd learned that silence was survival. Words were landmines. Questions were provocations. So she turned back to the sink, hands trembling as she rinsed a wine glass she'd already rinsed twice. That's when Lorenzo grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to bruise where people could see, but firm enough that she felt her bones compress. He pulled her close, his cologne mixing with the sweet rot of bourbon, and whispered against her ear that she was his wife, his possession, his investment. He'd paid off her family's debts, hadn't he? Given her a life she could never afford on her curator's salary. The least she could do was show some gratitude. He released her wrist and walked to the master bedroom, already dialing someone on his phone, laughing at a joke Isabella couldn't hear. She waited until his shower started running before she opened the safe hidden behind the Rothko in his office. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from the dozen times she'd rehearsed this. Inside, past the handgun and the legal documents, sat the black leather case. $3 million in cash, completely untraceable, completely off the books. Money from deals that existed only in whispered conversations and offshore havens. Money Lorenzo kept for emergencies, for situations when banks asked too many questions. Isabella didn't take it all. That would be noticed immediately. She took $700,000, just enough that Lorenzo might attribute the discrepancy to his own bad math, his own hazy recollection of how much he'd stashed. She resealed the case, reset the safe, and returned the Rothko to its precise position on the wall. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and cold and indifferent. Isabella Reed had just purchased her death. Gloria Reed answered on the first ring, even though it was 3 in the morning. Sisters know when sisters are drowning. Isabella sat in her parked car 6 blocks from the penthouse, engine off, phone screen casting blue light across her face. She didn't say hello. She said, "I need to disappear." There was a pause. Then Gloria's voice came through, steady and unsurprised. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the night he broke my rib and called it an accident." Gloria lived in Portland now, deliberately distant from the family wreckage, working as a paralegal for an immigration attorney. She knew how people vanished, how identities shifted, how paper trails went cold. She'd helped clients escape worse situations than abusive husbands, though none of those husbands had 12 city blocks and a body count. They spoke in careful code over the next 3 weeks. Coffee shops with no cameras. Burner phones purchased with cash. Gloria connected Isabella with Curtis Mahoney, a former Coast Guard officer who'd been dishonorably discharged for reasons he never specified, and now captained private charters in the Caribbean. Curtis had debts, the kind that made men flexible about maritime law and creative about incident reports. The plan crystallized over meticulously encrypted emails and face-to-face meetings in diners Lorenzo would never enter. The yacht cruise Lorenzo proposed became the perfect stage. Isolated waters, limited witnesses, plausible deniability. Curtis would be hired as the temporary crew replacement, a last-minute substitution that wouldn't raise suspicion. Lorenzo's usual captain had already been paid handsomely to call in sick. Isabella purchased a second phone, registered under a dead woman's identity Gloria had pulled from Portland public records. She opened a bank account in Grand Cayman using documents Curtis procured through contacts who didn't ask questions. The $700,000 would be wired in increments small enough to avoid detection, routed through 3 shell companies Gloria established using her legal access. The night before the cruise, Isabella sat in her studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings she'd never complete. She'd already shipped her favorite pieces to Gloria's address, labeled as gallery loans. Everything else, the clothes, the jewelry, the carefully curated life, would burn with her old identity. She drafted a suicide note on hotel stationery she'd stolen months ago, writing in the shaky hand of a woman who'd finally broken. She made it vague enough to be believed, specific enough to close the investigation quickly. She mentioned the pressure, the loneliness, the weight of being Mrs. Lorenzo Valez. She didn't mention the bruises, or the money, or the plan. Those secrets would die with Isabella Reed. The yacht cut through Caribbean waters under a sky too perfect for what was about to happen. Lorenzo stood at the helm with a scotch, conducting business over satellite phone, his voice carrying across the deck as he negotiated a waterfront construction deal that was anything but legitimate. Isabella watched from the cabin doorway, memorizing his profile one last time, cataloging the monster she was about to kill. Curtis moved across the deck with professional efficiency, checking lines that didn't need checking, positioning himself exactly where he needed to be. They hadn't spoken since boarding. Couldn't risk it. But when Lorenzo went below deck to take a private call, Curtis caught Isabella's eye and gave the slightest nod. Midnight. That was the window. Isabella waited in their stateroom, dressed in the silk nightgown Lorenzo preferred, the shawl he'd bought her in Monaco draped across her shoulders. She'd taken a sleeping pill crushed into Lorenzo's nightcap an hour earlier, watched him drain the glass, while discussing shipping routes with his attorney. Now he was unconscious in their bed, snoring with the deep rumble of chemically assisted sleep. She moved to the rear deck where Curtis was waiting. No words exchanged. He handed her the waterproof bag containing the second phone, cash, and the forged passport identifying her as Claire Morrison, widow, Canadian citizen. She stripped off the shawl and nightgown, already wearing the black wetsuit underneath. Curtis took the discarded silk, wrapped it carefully around the railing, let one sleeve dangle over the edge toward the black water. The suicide note went on the deck chair, weighted with her wedding ring. Isabella climbed down the swim platform where a small inflatable waited, engine killed, nearly invisible against the night ocean. Curtis had deployed it an hour ago while Lorenzo was drunk and indifferent. She slipped into the raft, lay flat, and Curtis covered her with a tarp and fishing gear. Then he made the call. By the time Lorenzo woke to shouting and emergency lights, Isabella was 3 nautical miles away, motoring toward a cargo ship Curtis had arranged. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, she was in a container marked agricultural equipment, heading toward Panama. By the time they found her shawl and note, she was already dead. The news reported it as a tragedy. Socialite wife of prominent businessman, lost at sea, presumed suicide. Lorenzo Valez buried an empty coffin and began hunting for ghosts. Lorenzo didn't cry at the funeral. He stood beside the mahogany casket in a black suit that cost more than most men earned in a year, accepting condolences with the hollow eyes of a man who'd lost something he never knew he valued. But his grief wasn't sorrow. It was rage wrapped in expensive fabric, a possessive fury that something of his had been taken without permission. The city felt it immediately. Lorenzo shut down operations for a week, not out of respect, but because he needed to think, needed to control the narrative, needed to own even her death. His men watched him carefully during those days, saw the way his jaw tightened when people mentioned Isabella's name, the way his hands curled into fists when the Coast Guard captain explained they might never recover her body. 2 days after the funeral, Lorenzo opened the safe. He stood in his office, the Rothko pushed aside, staring at the black leather case that felt too light in his hands. He counted once, then again, then a third time with the methodical precision of a man who'd built an empire on knowing exactly what he owned. $700,000. Gone. Vanished like his wife into the dark water. The case slipped from his hands and hit the floor. She'd stolen from him. Isabella, with her quiet elegance and careful silences, had robbed him blind. The realization rewired something fundamental in Lorenzo's understanding of the past year. Every moment of distance, every locked studio door, every refused touch, she'd been planning this. She'd played him, the man who prided himself on reading people, on controlling outcomes, on never being the fool. He called in favors from the Coast Guard investigator, from the medical examiner who would have handled the body if they'd found one, from the maritime lawyers who processed the death certificate. He hired 3 separate private investigators, men who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. He had Curtis background checked twice, ran financial audits on every crew member who'd been near that yacht. Nothing. The investigation came back clean. Tragic accident. Depressed wife. History of mental fragility that Lorenzo's own testimony had confirmed. The case closed within 6 weeks. But Lorenzo never believed it. He kept Isabella's studio exactly as she'd left it, a shrine to his suspicion. He never touched the money in the safe, left the gap there like an open wound. Some nights he'd stand in that room surrounded by her unfinished paintings and feel the ghost of her deception pressing against his chest. She'd escaped, and he couldn't prove it. 9 years passed, but Lorenzo Valez never moved on. He couldn't. Moving on required closure, and closure required a body, proof, an ending he could control. Instead, he lived in the suffocating space between grief and suspicion, between loss and rage, a man haunted not by love, but by the audacity of her escape. His empire expanded. He absorbed 2 rival territories, laundered money through a chain of luxury car dealerships, bought a judge and 3 city councilmen. Power grew, profits multiplied, but none of it filled the void Isabella had carved out when she took his money and his control in one calculated move. His men noticed the change. Lorenzo's temper, once explosive but brief, became a constant simmer. He'd fire associates for minor mistakes, cut off suppliers for perceived disrespect, break fingers over debts that were 2 days late instead of 2 weeks. His nephew, Rico, told the crew to walk carefully around the boss, that something in him had gone permanently cold after the yacht. Lorenzo never remarried, never even brought women to the penthouse anymore. Isabella's studio remained untouched, a mausoleum to his unresolved obsession. Some nights he'd stand in that room, staring at her unfinished paintings, running the numbers again in his head. 700,000. The only thing she'd taken besides her life. Except he didn't believe she'd taken her life at all. He hired private investigators every few years, different firms, different approaches. One specialized in financial forensics, tracing offshore accounts and shell companies. Another focused on identity fraud, scanning databases for women matching Isabella's description who'd appeared after 2016. A third worked international contacts, checking immigration records across the Caribbean and Central America. They all came back empty. No hits, no leads, no ghost of Isabella Reed in any system they could access. But Lorenzo kept paying them anyway, kept the case files in his office safe where the money used to be, kept her death certificate in his desk drawer like evidence in a trial that would never close. He'd pull it out sometimes, read the official language, lost at sea, presumed deceased, and feel the rage build fresh, 9 years old but sharp as broken glass. What would you do if someone stole from you and disappeared? Would you ever stop looking? If you believe people like Lorenzo, abusers who think they own other human beings, deserve to lose everything, hit that subscribe button. Only people who side with controlling monsters won't. Miami, 2025. Lorenzo wasn't supposed to be at the Aventura Mall that Saturday afternoon. He was supposed to be meeting a contractor about a hotel development deal, the kind of legitimate business he used to wash dirty money clean. But the contractor was late, and Lorenzo hated waiting in cars like some low-level associate. So he told his driver to park while he stretched his legs. The mall was exactly what he expected: overpriced boutiques, families with shopping bags, the sanitized wealth of people who'd never had blood on their hands. He walked past Gucci and Prada with his hands in his pockets, checking his phone, already composing the text that would end the contractor's career for wasting his time. Then he saw her. Not immediately. First, he saw the family. A man in a light blue shirt, casual and comfortable, helping 2 young boys carry shopping bags while a teenage girl walked ahead checking her phone. Normal. Boring. Forgettable. Except the woman beside the man turned her head to say something to the children, and Lorenzo's entire world stopped rotating. Isabella. Not someone who looked like Isabella. Not a woman with similar features or the same build. Isabella Reed. His wife. His dead wife. Standing 20 feet away in a black blazer and jeans, laughing at something one of the boys said, alive and whole and impossibly real. The shopping bag slipped from one of the boys' hands and hit the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in Lorenzo's skull. Their eyes met. He watched her face drain of color, watched recognition and terror flood her features in the same instant. The man beside her noticed, followed her gaze, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock as he registered Lorenzo's tattoos, his suit, the predatory stillness that marked him as dangerous. The teenage girl stopped walking. The 2 boys went quiet. The entire family froze in a tableau of mutual horror, caught in the moment where past and present collided with devastating force. Lorenzo couldn't breathe, couldn't move. 9 years of cold rage, 9 years of unanswered questions, 9 years of hunting ghosts crystallized into one singular, overwhelming truth. She'd faked it. All of it. The suicide, the grief, the empty coffin he'd buried. She'd stolen his money, staged her death, and built this comfortable little life while he rotted in suspicion. The rage that flooded his system was so pure it felt religious. Comment justice over deception if you're not on Isabella's side. Isabella didn't say a word. She grabbed the nearest child's hand, Rashad, the younger boy, and pulled. The movement broke the spell. Clarence, her husband, her safe and gentle husband who taught middle school science and coached Little League, didn't understand what was happening but understood the fear in his wife's eyes. He scooped up Tyrese, the older boy, while Tanya, their teenage daughter, stood paralyzed until Isabella hissed her name with such urgency that the girl moved. They ran. Not a full sprint. Not yet, but the rapid walk of people trying not to cause a scene while escaping disaster. They abandoned the shopping bags, left purchases scattered across the marble floor, and headed for the nearest exit. Isabella didn't look back. She knew Lorenzo would follow. Men like Lorenzo always followed. Lorenzo snapped into motion 30 seconds later. He pulled out his phone, already dialing Rico. Aventura Mall, North Entrance. Family of 5, woman in black blazer. I need eyes on every exit, traffic cameras, parking lot footage. Now, his nephew didn't ask questions. Within minutes, Lorenzo had 2 associates positioned at exit points, another accessing mall security through a contact who owed favors, and a 4th running license plates in the parking structure. The Valez organization moved with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this kind of hunt. They found the car in 12 minutes. A silver Honda Odyssey, minivan Suburbia, registered to Clarence and Claire Morrison. Claire. She'd even kept the same initials, the arrogance of it. The vehicle was already gone, but the security footage showed which direction they'd turned, and Lorenzo's people had resources the police could only dream of accessing. By evening, Lorenzo had an address. A modest 3-bedroom house in Coral Gables, mortgage under Clarence Morrison's name, a man with 0 criminal history, a teaching credential, and a credit score that screamed boring reliability. Background check came back clean, too clean. Clarence Morrison had no idea who he'd married. Lorenzo sat in his car across the street from their house as the sun set, watching lights turn on in the kitchen, seeing shadows move behind curtains. A basketball hoop in the driveway. A garden gnome by the mailbox. The kind of safe, normal life Isabella had purchased with his stolen money. He'd let them sleep tonight. Let them feel the terror build. Let Isabella explain to her unsuspecting husband exactly what kind of monster had just found them. Tomorrow, he'd introduce himself properly. Lorenzo watched their house for 3 days before making contact. He wanted to understand the full scope of her deception, catalog every detail of the life she'd built on the foundation of his money and her manufactured death. He saw Clarence leave each morning at 7:15, briefcase in hand, kissing Claire goodbye like she was something precious. He watched the boys wait for the school bus, backpacks too heavy for their small frames. He saw Tanya walk to a friend's car, typical teenager, completely unaware her entire existence was a lie. But mostly, he watched Isabella. She moved through that house like a different person. Lighter, softer, unafraid. She made breakfast without flinching at footsteps behind her. She laughed on the phone with someone, genuine and unguarded. She gardened in the backyard, hands in the soil, face tilted toward the sun like a woman who'd never known what it felt like to have her wrist crushed as a warning. It made Lorenzo's rage metastasize into something darker. On the 4th night, he let himself in. The lock was laughably simple, suburban security designed to stop opportunistic thieves, not men who'd broken into federal evidence rooms. He moved through the dark house with professional silence, past the boys' room, where superhero posters glowed faintly, past Tanya's door covered in banned stickers, straight to the master bedroom. Isabella was alone. Clarence was at a teacher's conference overnight, a detail Lorenzo had learned from the school district's online calendar. She slept peacefully, no nightmares, no jumping at shadows. The sleep of someone who thought they'd gotten away with it. Lorenzo didn't wake her. Not yet. Instead, he searched. He found his money in the attic, hidden inside luggage marked holiday decorations. Not all 700,000. She'd spent some on this house, on building Claire Morrison's credit history, on erasing Isabella Reed. But enough. 540,000 in vacuum-sealed packets. His emergency fund repurposed as her freedom fund. He left it there. Took nothing. He wanted her to know he'd been inside her sanctuary, touched her secrets, seen how thoroughly she'd betrayed him. Before leaving, Lorenzo placed a single item on her nightstand. Her wedding ring, the one she'd left on the yacht deck 9 years ago. The one the Coast Guard had bagged as evidence and Lorenzo had reclaimed after the case closed. Drop a like if you stand against people who think they can own and control others. Silence only protects abusers like Lorenzo. Isabella woke to the ring gleaming in the moonlight and knew her 9 years of peace had ended. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She simply sat up, picked up the gold band with trembling fingers, and understood that Lorenzo had been inside her home, inside her sanctuary, close enough to kill her while she slept, but choosing something worse: prolonged terror. The note came 2 days later, delivered by a teenager who'd been paid $20 and remembered nothing about the man who'd hired him. The message was simple: Storage Unit 447, Port of Miami. Midnight. Come alone, or I visit the school. She told Clarence she had a work emergency, kissed him like it might be the last time, and drove to the port with her hands shaking so badly she nearly crashed twice. The storage facility was industrial, isolated, the kind of place where screams disappeared into container ships and ocean wind. Lorenzo was waiting inside Unit 447, sitting on a chair he'd brought, surrounded by the remnants of her old life he'd excavated, photos from their penthouse, her studio paintings, and the luggage containing his money. 9 years, he said, voice calm as death. 9 years you let me think you were at the bottom of the ocean. Isabella stood in the doorway, escape already impossible. You were killing me slowly. I just chose a faster exit. You stole from me. You stole everything from me first. My dignity, my safety, The door behind her opened. Clarence stood there, panicked and confused, having followed his wife because something in her eyes at dinner had terrified him. Claire? What's going on? Who is this? Lorenzo smiled, and Isabella's blood turned to ice. I'm her husband, Lorenzo said, standing. The real one. Clarence looked between them, understanding dawning in fragments. The fear in his wife's eyes, the tattooed man's predatory stillness, the money stacked against the wall. Claire, we need to leave. Now. He reached for Isabella's arm. Lorenzo reached faster. The gunshot was deafening in the metal container. Clarence dropped, clutching his stomach, blood spreading across his teacher's button-down like spilled ink. Isabella screamed, lunged forward, but Lorenzo caught her, held her back as Clarence's breathing went shallow and wet. You have a choice, Lorenzo whispered against her ear. I call 911 right now. He maybe survives. But you come back to New York. You, the kids, all of it. You're mine again, and this time, you don't get to leave. Isabella looked at Clarence dying on concrete, at Lorenzo's phone in his hand, at the 9 years of freedom bleeding out in front of her. Please, she whispered. Save him. Lorenzo smiled and dialed. Would you sacrifice your freedom to save someone you love? Comment below. But here's what Isabella didn't know. Lorenzo had already decided Clarence's fate the moment he walked through that door. The ambulance would come. Clarence would survive, barely, with injuries that would take months to heal and questions that would haunt him forever. But he'd live, because Lorenzo didn't need Clarence dead. He needed Clarence broken. He needed Isabella to return to New York knowing she'd traded her freedom for her husband's life. Knowing every day that Lorenzo could change his mind, could finish what he started, could reach across the miles and destroy everything she loved. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. Police came with them, but Lorenzo's attorney was already on the phone, spinning a story about a robbery gone wrong, about Clarence being a hero, about Lorenzo being a witness who'd called for help. Money changed hands. Statements were adjusted. Security footage mysteriously corrupted. By sunrise, Clarence was in surgery and Isabella was on a private plane to New York. The children, Tyrese, Rashad, and Tanya, would be told their mother had to take care of a sick relative. Clarence would be told his wife had family obligations she couldn't avoid. Both stories were lies wrapped around the same truth. Isabella Reed belonged to Lorenzo Valez, and death had never been enough to free her. Lorenzo didn't move Isabella back into the penthouse. That would be too obvious, too cruel even for him. Instead, he set her up in a brownstone in Brooklyn, close enough to monitor, far enough to maintain the illusion of her separate life. The children would visit on weekends, supervised visits where Lorenzo would play the generous family friend, the wealthy benefactor helping out during difficult times. But Isabella knew the truth. She saw it in the way Lorenzo's men were always nearby, watching her grocery runs, her coffee stops, her every movement. She felt it in the weekly phone calls where Lorenzo would ask about her day with the casual menace of a man checking inventory. If you believe no one should have to live in fear like this, hit subscribe. Only people who think control and abuse are acceptable won't. The money, what remained of the $540,000, Lorenzo took back, every dollar. He deposited it in the same safe, behind the same Rothko, in the same penthouse where this had all started. He didn't need the money. He needed the principle. Isabella tried once, 3 months after returning, to take the children and run. She made it as far as the George Washington Bridge before Lorenzo's car pulled alongside hers. He didn't threaten her. Didn't need to. He simply smiled and held up his phone. Clarence's hospital room pulled up on a live security feed Lorenzo had installed. She turned the car around. Tanya was the first to figure it out, the teenage girl with her mother's eyes and her mother's instinct for danger. She asked Isabella one night why they really moved, why Mom seemed scared all the time, why that tattooed man kept appearing at family dinners like he owned them. Isabella wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to warn her daughter about men like Lorenzo, about the price of escape, about how some cages have invisible bars. But she couldn't, because Lorenzo had made it clear the children's safety depended on Isabella's silence and compliance. So she lied, said everything was fine, said Mr. Valez was just an old family friend helping them through tough times. Tanya didn't believe her, but she stopped asking. What would you tell your daughter in Isabella's position? How do you protect your children from a monster you can't escape? Years would pass this way. Isabella would age in her Brooklyn cage, watching her children grow up under Lorenzo's shadow, seeing Clarence recover physically but never emotionally. The man she'd married now hollowed out by questions he'd never get answered. She'd think about the yacht sometimes, about the night she'd been so close to freedom, about Curtis and Gloria, and the life that had lasted exactly 9 years before Lorenzo reclaimed what he thought he owned. And Lorenzo, he'd visit regularly, sit at her dinner table, play the benevolent patron while his presence reminded everyone in that room exactly who held the power. He never touched her again, never needed to. The violence was in the watching, in the knowing, in the absolute control he'd reestablished. He'd won, not by killing her, but by making her live. If you can't stand people like Lorenzo, men who believe they own other human beings, who use fear as currency, who turn love into a weapon, comment. Everyone deserves freedom. Let me know you're not on his side. This is Empire Stories, where we don't just tell stories, we expose the truth about power, control, and the people who escape monsters only to be dragged back into hell. Subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of the criminal world. Hit that notification bell, because these stories need to be told, and people like Lorenzo need to be exposed for exactly what they are. The brownstone still stands in Brooklyn. Isabella still lives there. Lorenzo still visits. And somewhere in a Miami hospital, years ago, Clarence Morrison woke up from surgery and asked for his wife, never knowing that the moment he'd followed her to that storage unit, he'd sealed both their fates. Some prisons don't have bars. Some sentences last lifetimes. And some men like Lorenzo Valez never face justice, because they've built empires where justice can't reach them. But at least now, you know the truth.